Welcome to another album Yapcast. This week we are talking about the pros and cons and taking just a greater look at home recording. So let's get into it.
Specifically, like, I won't say at an amateur level, but it at home means you don't have a professional level studio in your house.
Yeah.
In this case.
Karl's calling me out.
Everybody with them Scarlets.
Hey, we haven't used this Scarlet in a while. I don't think I ever used it for music.
That's so fair.
I think I always had it, but I never had an XLR mic until way after I had better things.
That's a terrifying statement.
There definitely is a large variance in there, but I just wanted to make a point and say that, like, it doesn't mean like people that have pro studios in their house recording at home. That's not what we're talking about. Most of the pitfalls of recording at home do come to what you're able to spend money on and what you're able to afford, and that's fine. That makes it way more accessible. The fact that the price is lower barrier to entry. We are getting a lot of types of music that really weren't. Well, types is wrong. We're getting a lot of music that wasn't really going to ever come out before. You know, there's a lot more opportunities for people to make music. There's a lot more opportunities for this stuff to happen. And as things get better technology-wise, the things just get cheaper. We can do more with plugins, or we can do more with this and that. Well, we're probably kind of cresting that hill, but it's just going to get better over time. That's where I was going.
I think there's just a lot of negatives that come with at-home recording. I mean, obviously we do it, and we've put some rough stuff out. It adds to so much being like put out, and there's no filter anymore, you know. But the filter prior was kind of a terrible filter. It was just whatever the radio host wanted to play. And now it's just you have so much stuff. It's one, impossible to listen to it all. Two, there's just so much bad stuff that I don't like go too far out past what I know, because you're like, oh, what's this song? Oh, it's terrible. I don't want to listen to it. And you go right back to your playlist.
I think at-home recording is in a good spot right now. I think at-home distribution is the real problem, if there is a problem. Because I think for, $20 a month, DistroKid, that's insane. It gets it on every streaming platform, no matter what you're making. That is a problem. Yeah, and I even just like I haven't tried I have DistroKid and Lander.
Yep.
I found out recently Lander does distribution. Mm-hmm. Had no idea. Haven't used that yet, but I'm sure something will get dropped using that soon.
There's been similar stuff for medium to smaller artists for a while. You know, we had CD Baby for a long time. There's been a lot of more routes for homebrew recording for a long time, because I mean, people have been home recording since before digital. You know, we talk about doing like Tascam stuff where you're using a cassette recorder, and I mean, yeah, at that point you had to pay a lot for these cassette recorders comparatively to what we're talking about now with interfaces, but you'd have to pay quite a bit for a cassette recorder, and then you would have to take the cassette recorder itself down to the studio and get someone to help you mix it and get it out. But there's a lot more stuff than you probably would think has been made that way. You know, there are no examples right off the top of my head, but there's a lot of famous artists that are known for kind of overdriving the cheap stuff they have at home and making that work. And there's a lot of cool experimentation that's come out of that side of it. But honestly, at this point, that's more of like I'd almost call that like a project studio. When I usually will say like the step above home studio. You know, you're not in a professionally treated room, but you've probably got some room treatment up. You've probably got some analog gear. You probably know a little of what you're doing, that kind of stuff. You know, there's a defined step there, but home recording kind of split off and became that when we got interfaces and got that kind of thing, and the whole digital thing kind of opened it up, and it just leads to a bunch of I won't say drawbacks, but it leads to a lot of people like really, really overproducing stuff. You know, there's kind of this belief that you can just be bad and fix it in the box. And the answer is no, you really can't. I mean, even with auto-tune, like you can't well, you can, but you can't take someone that's talking and auto-tune it and it sound like they're singing. It's just going to sound like they're talking in pitch. You know, you can't make a software instrument do this and do that. I mean, we're getting there with AI to the point where soon it will probably be hard to tell what's real and what's not. We're right there, but there's just a lot of people that either try to do too much or know so little they overdo everything, and it leads to a lot of really interesting problems musically and getting stuff done. Just down to there's a lot of options, so you tend to get decision paralysis figuring out, oh well, you know what, once you figure out what a compressor is, what compressor do I want to use? And there goes 3 hours of your life. You know, the stuff that, as someone that's had time and training and spent time in studios and done that kind of stuff, I at least have an educated guess as to what compressor I want to use on a track. You know, I know what I like, that kind of stuff.
There's only one reverb plugin I will ever use again.
Yeah, that's similar stuff. You know, there's a lot of hard stuff that I think people think just because it's cheap that it's easy. And, you know, those two things are separated, because there's a lot of great albums that have come out cheap, but there's been a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of knowledge put into them.
I thought this was definitely going to be a more against at-home recording video than it turned out to be.
I mean, I have a lot of problems with home recording, and most of them come to trying to do drums. And my distaste for sampled drums, mostly because they're just taking money out of people's pockets by doing that. Like, I understand that, you know, you couldn't have got the album out otherwise and this and that, but especially in a lot of newer genres, like, just use a sample or just use a drum machine. Just use a beat that's pre-made. Like, don't sit there and try to plug something into whichever drummer plug-in is the best this week and think it's going to turn out sounding like a real drummer. I can tell 9 times out of 10 if something's fake, and I can tell if something's being supplemented 9 times out of 10 unless it's done by someone really good. I don't know. That's the really hard one, because drums are, I won't say they're the hardest part. Mixing is probably the hardest part. Making the decisions is probably the hardest part. But as far as the recording side, getting the drums to sound good and to then sound good in the mix is really hard, just because what we think of as drums sounding like from listening to albums is not actually what drums sound like, even remotely.
Yeah. I mean, if we want to go towards the negative side, a lot of the gear is just not up to snuff, and they get you with it because they're like, oh, get this $50 interface, you can make your own music. They're bad. Like, there's too much noise, and they're just not built well. But I mean, they're reliable as a backup to a backup if you need something and everything goes wrong. It's just, you got to spend the money sometimes. Now, I'm not saying go $10,000, but like $250, $300, $400. It's about what you should be spending on an interface when you're starting out.
Yeah, I haven't hit my old interface with a hammer yet, but that'll be in a video eventually.
And then, like, microphones are a big one, because just there's so many, and so many do different things, especially with the interfaces you're plugging into, and there's just a whole lot of predatory cheap stuff that people buy, realize it's junk, and then throw out. So it's just, and cheap is a relative term. Is, you know, it's $40, $50, $60 for some of these mics, and they're just not good, or for these interfaces, and they're not good for what is like distributable. And if you're just using it to learn, go for it. But if you want to distribute it, it's gonna cost some money to do it.
Yeah, but going back to like some of what we were talking about earlier, a lot of what the gear we use was designed for was literally just to create demos, or just to be able to get thoughts down. A lot of times when they were designing this gear, it wasn't ever thought that someone would try to put this out as a polished product. At no point were live sound mics supposed to be used in recording situations either. You know, we've kind of developed to make stuff work and do certain things depending on what. And I will say, with technology like it is, $100 mic is considerably better than it was 10 years ago. And they didn't exist 10 years before that, or if they did, they were all really bad live sound mics. So, you know, as far as the relative price gaps go, things are just getting better and better. Now that's about to stop because all the good cheap stuff comes out of a place that just got destroyed by the economy. But you know, if for now, where you can still enjoy it for a little bit.
It is nice to see that we are kind of at least getting better and cheaper, like running like coincide. You know, it's something that you wouldn't expect musicians and especially music companies to do because they're grubby. We know it.
It's kind of funny because like the recording industry is nothing like the guitar industry. Because we all come from kind of seeing that background. It's like, so, you know, at a certain point in the day, no one will buy a guitar that has the wrong name on the headstock, even if it is better. When it comes to things like microphones and music technology, most of the time, they're just going to buy the cheapest one, unless the name on the thing really, really matters. So that's why companies like Behringer are just absolutely destroying, because they can take something and illegally make a clone of it, something that they shouldn't be cloning, and then manufacture it quasi-legally, and then that's how you get it for, you know, a tenth of the price or less most of the time. So the other side of that is a lot of these companies are really grubby, and they want to milk every ounce out of something that was designed 50 years ago. Just because that's their whole marketing plan, is to take the thing and not change it and continue just trying to get profits out of it. So that's some of that too.
Yeah, I think in my mind, the mic to have is still the same one that from when I started looking into recording like 7 or 8 years ago. I think it's still the same mic. It's still like $800.
It's not a lot for, you know, if we're talking Pro Studio, around $800 as a beginner mic.
I'm talking like at home
Yeah.
production, but
Yeah.
yeah, I know there's quite a ceiling above that, but
Yeah, and even new, even if you're not talking about vintage, it can get pretty crazy. When you start talking about vintage and certain years stuff was good, and then you get stuff that was used on recordings here and recordings there. But a lot of people may or may not know this. This doesn't necessarily have to do with home recording, but if you're living in somewhere that's got a big studio, somewhere that's got a lot of studios, there will normally be places that rent things like that. So you can go and rent a vintage microphone, or you can go and rent a certain snare drum or a certain guitar or a certain amp just for the recording session. And that's how a lot of smaller studios actually make that work, because the cost of the gear is just, it's obscene when you get to the pro level stuff. I mean, it's like, I don't even know how to explain how much studio foam costs to people. You know, it's like one panel of foam is over $100, and people are like, "What? How is this different than an egg crate?" You know, it's like, well, I mean, it does its job better, but does it do its job 100 times better than you would think?
say even on the low end of that, every time I've looked in like a record-sized square of it's like $60.
Yeah, you can get cheaper stuff than that. They're normally, so a record's a 1 foot, so they're normally a 1x1 tile. So the big trick, you start looking at stuff like that, is you'll start seeing the really cheap stuff is like really thin. So it'll be the right size, but it'll be super thin, so it's not going to give you a lot of dampening. But all of that stuff's kind of interesting anyway, because a lot of people, even in kind of the YouTuber world, think that you can just put up studio foam and your room's going to sound better. And the answer is actually no. The answer is you have to know where to put up studio foam and know what you're fighting and know what you're doing there. And that again just comes back to one of the scariest things about home recording is the room matters a lot. It's probably time for my favorite piece of advice that I give people that do home recording is just record in the deadest spot you can find. And normally it is your closet, and leave the clothes in.
Yep. Yeah, I know for mine, I have not, balled out on studio foam, but I have a stack of exercise mats that I'm going to double stack and staple to the wall eventually. But that's also in a closet with a bunch of clothes in it, so it'll do what it needs to do. It's also got a foam thing around the mic, so it's hopefully going to be good enough.
You know, I guess the moral of the story of what I've been trying to say is, like, there's a reason that albums cost what they do to produce. And it comes down to the cost of the expertise and the cost of the stuff you're using, and it's down to the musicians that are going to be playing what they deserve to be paid for the amount of time. And because trust me, if a record company didn't have to shell out tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, to get an album made, they would not do it.
I think at-home recording, at the end of the day, is a positive, right? It's a great thing if you want to record a demo tape or make something for you and your buddies or something like that. But unless you've got quite a bit of money poured into it, I wouldn't do any distribution. And it's really hard to get at-home production, especially if you're the only one working on it. That's the other thing we haven't really touched on. When you're one person doing everything, you're going to burn out that song.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to know what it's supposed to sound like. It's just going to be the vision that you have in your head that's locked in, and you're going to get very tunnel vision on it. It happens to the best of us.
And there's a lot of that stuff that you literally can't, like, I won't say you can't. No one should master their own mixes. And in an ideal world, you shouldn't be mixing a song that you're performing on anyway. So it's kind of an interesting thing, especially if you're doing a lot of effects and making a lot of changes to the way you sound. There's a lot of negatives to working on your own stuff, but it just creates so many interesting problems, because it's like, okay, so to record a track and I want to sing, I then need to learn how to correctly dial in compression, correctly dial in reverb. So if I don't know how to do that, I'll think I sound bad, when in fact it's just that I have no idea how to do that. So the options are to spend, 10, 12 hours on YouTube watching videos of people explaining how to do this, and just kind of figure out what's going on. And then, learn what plugins to download, install, and then run presets on. And then if you figure all that out and get in there, now you're in round 2 of, okay, well, I just lost all the creativity I had. So a lot of the time that you could be making music is spent doing the other stuff, which is hard and deserves to have time spent into it. But at the end of the day, do you want to end up being a musician, or do you want to end up being someone that's a producer or a mixer or an engineer? What is the thing that you want to do, and spend time focusing on that.
Jumping back a little bit to what you're saying about not mixing what you record, I stopped sending an artist that was recording with us. He may or may not have been featured on this podcast a couple times. I stopped sending him the files like right after recording, because he would love to listen to them on the way home. And I had to stop sending it to him because he gets so attached to what it sounded like unmixed that he didn't like it after the mix, because he listened to it so many times before I even got to touch it.
That's cool. That's someone that must have been really open, because the general rule for me is, like, I'll give myself at least, especially if I'm recording a practice session, I'll give myself 24 hours before I go in and really listen to it. So, I have a little bit of expertise having done a few albums where I've replaced drums for people. And when I used to do that and have all the gear to do that, I would essentially, rent out a space. I would go set up all the gear. I'd play for the 4 hours it's going to take to play through an album, that's 2 takes a song by the time you're running everything in, 2 or maybe 3 if it's something hard. Then I would wait 2 days to go back and give them a rough mix, because I don't want to hear the mistakes. I don't want to be in that situation. If there's not something that's glaringly obvious, I don't want to have to go back and fix it in real time, because you just get so mean to yourself.
It did get to a point where both of us would know when a take was the one. Like, he'd record it, and then he'd stand up, start running around the room. We would know that we were taking that one, but certain things in the mix would change. It'd be like, I don't like that. Don't put that back. I was like, no, that's not mixed. We can't put that back.
I was going to go back to the advice I always tell people, but now I don't even remember what the advice was going to be. So you start with a really dead room to record in.
Record in the most dead spot.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, we talked about that earlier. What it had something to do with? Oh, it's have an idea of what you want. Is probably the second biggest piece of advice. Is find some way to be able to make artistic decisions in real time, because that cuts down your decision paralysis and stuff on the end. That's at this point when plugins are 90% as good as the analog hardware. That's the reason studios are still full of very, very expensive analog hardware, is because once you record with it on, you've now committed, and that's part of the process. Making those choices is helpful, is really helpful, because if you have an idea of what you want it to look like at the end and you can kind of sculpt it the way, someone's going to know this, that there's a famous sculptor that says you just take away all the parts that aren't the statue whenever you're carving out of a rock. You start with a rock and take away the parts that aren't the naked man or whatever. I tend to say the same thing about recording, is like, if you have an idea of what the end picture is going to be, you can then make the correct decisions as you're going forward. Yeah. So, being able to do that's a big thing. That goes back to reference tracks being super helpful in mixing. I recommend everybody run, and you don't have to stick to one. Your song doesn't have to sound exactly like X song. You can have a couple of reference tracks and do stuff that way, but that's going to let you know in general, like, how loud does this need to be versus that, and how much noise is acceptable, and this and that. You find some songs that sound really good. The other good piece of advice is, don't assume you can fix it afterwards, because even if you can, you're spending a lot more time fixing it afterwards than not. And if you're in a home recording situation, you're not getting any of the benefits. So in a pro studio situation, half the reason they're fixing stuff in post is to protect people's egos and to save them money, or because the artist couldn't do it. So when you're in a home studio situation, even if you're working with another artist, you're probably not getting paid a lot for your time, and they're probably not a big artist with a big ego. Just fix it. There's still going to be auto-tune, there's still going to be compression and reverb and all that stuff on the other end, but just don't assume you can fix it later. That's probably the third piece of advice, right? So I got record in a dead room, have an idea of what you're doing in general. That's really helpful. And then don't assume you can fix it in post. The other thing I'll say is, like, don't think you have to put plugins on everything. 9 times out of 10 when I help someone work on a project, half of what I do is take stuff off. Learn to work efficiently and how to do that stuff, because a lot of people will just stack plugins on everything. And I'm like, cool, there's probably a couple plugins that you can run on every channel, and that's important, but you don't need compression on every channel. You also don't need to stack 100 vocal takes to get a wall of sound. There's a lot of diminishing returns to a lot of that stuff.
I really don't dislike at-home recording. I just genuinely think that money should be spent if you really want to do something with your music. It sounds mean to say that, but there are people who are trained to do specifically what you're trying to learn how to do, and they've been doing it a lot longer than you. Sometimes you just got to cough up the extra money and let them put out the best version of your product. But record the demo at home.
Although, I will say this, when I write at home, 9 times out of 10, if I go downstairs and turn the computer on and get everything ready to record, I've already forgot the idea. So most of my demos get recorded on the voice recorder on my phone instead of using all the nice gear that I have. And I'm pretty capable of getting projects done, so I still have to rent a room to go do drums the right way, but with guitar modelers and stuff like that, being able to reamp and doing that kind of stuff, I can get great guitar tones in the box, even though I'm not a great guitar player. I can get decent vocals at home doing that kind of stuff. The only reason I say decent is because I don't have any expensive mics, but you'll learn where to spend the money the right places, and there's a lot you can do at home, but don't be scared of doing some of both. Don't think that just because you're recording an album, you're going to be in the studio doing all of this stuff. The best way to utilize your time is to go in and be prepared and only record exactly what you need to. There's no reason you're in the studio recording rhythm guitar tracks. If you're doing your first album, there's literally no reason to do that. Solos, sure, but there's no reason to sit in there and figure out all the overdub stuff unless your producer's part of the creative process and you've got a bunch of money. But if you're trying to do an album on a budget, there's a lot of good ways to do kind of a hybrid workflow and figure everything out. And that's kind of, again, less of home studio, more of project studio level stuff. But most of the guys that are successful in doing it, I would say, have some kind of hybrid between the two. Still go to the studio when they need to.
Thank you all for watching this album Yapcast. If you enjoyed, leave a like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.